Well, Mr. President, can I thank you very warmly for inviting me here. I last spoke in this chamber 50 years ago. Not much has changed, but it's great to be back. And it was a particular privilege to speak after Jacob Rees-Mogg. He was one of the names that I called to mind a few weeks ago when I heard that the Conservatives were rebranding themselves as the Workers' Party. And he has these delightful self-deprecating anecdotes about campaigning in the Labour heartlands of Scotland in his mother's Mercedes with the family nanny. And I think only a week ago he was launching his latest campaign for social justice, demanding that the quality of champagne in the Lords be kept at a higher level than that in the Commons. I think these gestures would be kind of rather endearing, were it not for the fact that he is a representative of a party that within the last few weeks has determined to remove about £1,000 a year from 3 million of the poorest families in this country, and about £250 a year from the 13 million poorest families in the country. Quite unnecessary, even when you factor in the effects of the improvement in the minimum wage. A deliberate decision has been made by this government to redistribute income from poor to rich. Now, I use the word this government, this. Jan, in his introduction, made a very good speech, and he referred to an awful lot of things which I'm sure many of us are enthusiastic about. The increase in employment, the fall in unemployment. He talked about the generous aid program of the government. He talked about gay marriage. But of course, these were not introduced by this government. They were introduced by the government of which I was a part, the coalition government that preceded it. And since May, we have a very different kind of government. And that's what you're being asked to make a judgment on tonight. This government was elected with roughly 37% of the vote, about 1 in 4 adults of the adult population. When we formed the coalition government, it was very different. We had two parties that made up a substantial majority of the voting public at a time of national crisis. As Jacob has already acknowledged, it was an important historical event. We were faced with the biggest financial crisis in my lifetime, probably since the middle of the 19th century. And we grappled with it, and we did some difficult and often unpleasant things. But we began to turn the economy around. Significant improvements in employment, in growth, in living standards beginning to appear. And that was under a period of coalition government. And what we now have to assess is how that has changed. And things have already begun to change in the 5 months we've had since David Cameron came back in a Commons majority. Now, they talk about themselves as being the party of the centre. But of course, the centre is a relative concept. It's not an absolute concept. I seem to remember Joseph Stalin once described himself as middle of the road because he had Trotsky on his left. That's, middle of the road is relative. And this government has moved very strongly to the right. Let me just take 1 or 2 key areas. And one of them, and probably the most important, is in relation to fiscal policy of the economy. I subscribe to the need for budget discipline, and I administered it in my own department. We made 25% cuts, the department that Sajid has inherited. It was difficult. But what has happened since the election is that the Chancellor has redefined the deficit in a much more restrictive way. In 3 years' time, the government's commitment is to eliminate all government borrowing, even government borrowing for productive public investment. The effects of this are to have cuts operating at roughly twice the level of severity that we judge to be necessary in the coalition or are economically required. It is largely ideologically driven. And I feel for my successor. He's a very able guy and very estimable in many ways. He's now drawn the short straw. Because we did the sums when I was in government. The department that he leads and I led is responsible for the factors that are fundamental to our long-term economic recovery and the productivity of our country. Areas of training, vocational education, further education, science, innovation, supporting long-term investment by British industry. And under the new government, not under the one I was in, we had assurances, and indeed in writing from the Treasury, that these key areas would be protected. Under this new government, these things will be cut between 25 and 40%. And I can assure you that there is no way that this can be done without doing substantial damage to the long-term productive base of our country. Let me just take another area which follows from the very good intervention right at the end about housing, somebody reminding us about the housing issue in this country. There were figures emerged this week that the average price of a house in London, the average, is about 500,000. Now think about that. The median wage is 25,000. So you're talking about the price of a house that is getting on for 20 times the income of a middle-level worker. Way, way beyond any conceivable capacity of an average individual to buy into property or even to rent. Now, I would imagine there are people in this room, probably not too many, who've got rich parents and who will solve this problem for them. I don't want to stereotype the Oxford Union, but I'm sure there are a few of you in that fortunate position. The vast majority of you are not. And what you will find growing increasingly by the day is a widening gap between the younger and the older generation governed by access to the housing market. And what is this government's response to it? The one thing that they have introduced since we left office was a decision to undermine fundamentally the ability of housing associations, charities, to provide social housing at affordable rents for people on low income, and to force them to sell off their stock without necessarily replacing it. Something that is economically stupid and actually absolutely wicked. Let me just turn to another area. In her introduction, Kate mentioned the response to the refugee crisis, which I think was an indicator of a much more illiberal approach to public affairs. But I'll just take one example of how this is now going to play out, and it relates to the very existence of this union. Because what you stand for, Mr. President, and everybody in here, is freedom of speech. And often this involves, and I'm sure you have it on your agenda, to invite people here who are controversial and provocative, who some people might regard as extreme. Now, 2 years ago, the Home Secretary was very concerned, indeed we all are, about Islamic fundamentalism and the militancy associated with it. And we all agreed, if somebody is involved in terrorist activity and the promotion of terrorism or inciting violence, the criminal law has got to be used with the maximum effect. But what was being proposed was that people with extreme views should be curbed, and that universities would have a responsibility for making sure that people of that type should not appear. Now, when this proposition was put to me as the Secretary of State, and I had responsibility for universities, I stopped it with my Lib Dem colleagues. We now realise that in the counter-terrorism bill, now going to go into Parliament in the next few months, these powers to restrict the freedom of speech for what somebody arbitrarily describes as extreme views will be implemented. And I think that, more than any other factor, illustrates the way we are now drifting into a government that is increasingly extreme, that is harsh, that is illiberal and very unrepresentative. And I worry about it, and I worry about it not least because we've got such an ineffectual opposition. My own party is now in a very weak state. I'm sure we shall recover, and that brilliant speech you heard a few minutes ago was an indication of how and when that will happen. But I'm afraid Mr. Corbyn's Facebook army is not in a position to deal with this. But what we do need to acknowledge is that this is a government that is taking the country in the wrong direction. And that's why I would urge you to support this motion. Thank you very much.